about her newest book. Gabrielle is a writer who challenges conventional wisdom on personal subjects. Her previous book on why women drink and how they gain control was a New York Times bestseller, and her work on mental health, medicine, and culture has been published in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times, the Daily Beast, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Atlantic, and many more publications. Over her decades of work as a journalist and an author, Gabrielle has examined how practices in one era have had unexpected and often devastating consequences in the years that followed. So if you think about it, she's really the perfect author to have tackled this particular subject. I've taken Gabrielle's, I've been taken personally with Gabrielle's work as an adoptee with a very similar story to the one that is told in The American Baby. And I so appreciate her style of examining both the sweeping historical trends along with the stories of people's lives that are most deeply affected by them. American Baby, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption has gotten more press in the last couple of weeks than any other book dealing with adoption that I've personally ever seen. It's been featured in the New York Times, Time Magazine, on NPR, and on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, just to name a few. In fact, earlier today, Gabrielle was hosting a TV crew at her house from CBS Sunday Morning, and I hear that they were there for, it sounds like, more than 8 hours. So we really appreciate Gabrielle joining us this evening. You can learn more about Gabrielle at her website, which is gabrielleglaser.com, and I will post that in the chat later this evening as well. So with that, we will hand it over to Gabrielle, and then we'll go into question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here. I met Betsy early on in the pandemic. She had read a copy of the book and was interested in hosting this talk a long time ago. So thanks everybody for being here again. And let me just say, I do not have a personal connection to adoption. I'm not an adoptee. I'm not a birth mother. I'm not an adoptive mother. But the concept and story of loss and longing and separation is really one that is a human story that is one for the ages. And I was first introduced to the topic of adoption as a reporter at the Oregonian in 2003. And let me just give you this brief background. This was prior to the days of social media. And I'm an Oregonian, and in my home state, as in every other place at that time, your local coffee shop was your social media. And I had seen on the cork board by the door a piece of paper that struck me as just profoundly, it just struck me because of its imagery. And it had highlighter yellow stick figures with straight black hair. Again, they were highlighter yellow, and a sort of angry mouth and slanted black eyes. And when I saw the images, I was shocked. I thought, that's so racist. And then I saw the words above the images, and it said, "Are you an angry Korean American adoptee? We are, and we can help you." And there was the little tear off number, remember those little cutout pieces of paper you had? I called the number and I wrote a story about, actually, it wasn't a story, it was just in their own words. Oregon was the center of the original international adoption, which was adoption from Korea to a small place, Eugene, Oregon, and there were an overwhelming number of Korean American adoptees in the United States who were reversing the narrative of what it meant to be an adoptee, to what it meant to have been, quote unquote, rescued. And they were very vocal about their experiences. And I, in positioning this piece, which I didn't really write, it was just for adoptees who each maybe we set up with photographs and put everything in their own words. When I came back to work it was in a Sunday feature piece. It was the headliner of the feature section in those days when newspapers landed on your door with a thud on a Sunday, and the feature section was what a lot of people, including me, really loved reading. And I was lucky enough to be a writer for it. And when I came back to the office on Monday morning, I was overwhelmed with angry emails and angry emails from adoptive parents who said, "How dare you?" Um, we did rescue those children we brought from Korea. We gave them good homes, and how dare they be ungrateful for this experience that we gave them. At the same time, adoptees, things were just beginning to go viral. There wasn't, as I said, there wasn't social media, but things were just beginning to go viral. People were emailing each other links to stories. And on the flip side of that were an equal number of emails from adoptees who said, wow, um, this reflects our experience. And what struck me as a journalist who really loves to look at conventional narratives and hold them up to the light was that adoption begins with loss. And it was something that stayed with me. It was a thread that endured in my coverage of how families put themselves together in the Pacific Northwest for several years. And fast forward to 2007, where I was writing a pretty standard feature about a man who was adopted in the Jewish community. I'm Jewish, and the story somehow landed on my desk about a man who was a cantor, which is a person in a synagogue who leads people in prayer and song. And he needed a kidney, and he was getting a kidney donation from a beloved friend and a fellow congregant. And I wrote, again, as I said, a pretty standard feature about this guy who was getting a kidney donation and from a living person. And it was really more or less to write about the possibility of, friends who happen to be a match donating kidneys. But when I walked into the dialysis center where I was meeting this man, David Rosenberg, for the first time, first of all, he invited me to meet him in the dialysis center, which is a really unusual place to have a first interview, let alone a first meeting. I don't know if anybody here has been in a dialysis center, but it's pretty much at the intersection of life and death. Your blood is being cleaned by a giant machine, and the clean blood goes to the blood that needs to be clean is coming out of you in one arm and going back into you on another. And David was a gregarious guy. He was super outspoken, funny, warm, pillar in the community. And he said, maybe 20 minutes into the conversation, I hope this story goes viral, and I hope my birth mother sees it. I'd like more information for my kids. He was happily married and had 3 children. And what he said was, I would really like to be able to have more medical history. He also had been diagnosed with thyroid cancer. He had had a number of medical issues. And the way he presented the story, and I absolutely, this is what he said. I have no reason to believe otherwise, is that he wanted more medical history. And the story did go viral in the Pacific Northwest, and as a result, 7 other people donated kidneys. But the story did not go viral in a way that his birth mother in New York City had been able to see it. And in that first meeting, he told me my birth mother was a girl in trouble in 1961, and the belief that he had about himself was that he'd been an inconvenience to her. He had been raised and adopted by absolutely wonderful people who he loved deeply and who loved him beyond all measure of a doubt. They doted on him. They 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 provided him with everything he possibly could need, including, first and foremost, unconditional love. And David, I have to say, did not ever present himself as terribly curious about his birth family. But in 2014, he was dying, and his wife had given him 23andMe for his birthday in December of 2013. And they had hoped that he would find more medical information. They had hoped that he would maybe learn more about his biological heritage. But also, there was the sneaking suspicion, the sneaking hope that maybe he would be able to reunite with birth relatives. And as I know, it's not going to be a surprise to anybody listening here that New York State at the time was one of the states that was completely locked down in terms of closed, secretive adoptions. So in 2014, David called and said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, "Now I am." And he said, "I found my birth mother." I'd moved from Portland to New Jersey. He said, "I found my birth mother. She lives 45 minutes from you. And she loved me all my life. She didn't want to give me up. She married my birth father. They have they had three other children. I have three full siblings. And David, as a cantor who'd made a career as a vocalist, as a singer in his community, learned that he had a full sister who was an opera singer in Berlin. And the tenor of the conversation, no pun intended, he was a tenor, but the tenor of the conversation was, if only he had known sooner about this separation between him and his birth mother and her valiant attempts as a teenager in New York City against all odds to try to fight to keep him. She was no match for her family. She was no match for her community, for her religious community, and she was certainly no match for City Hall. And the part of the conversation, that initial conversation that chilled me to the bone, was that she was threatened with juvenile hall. She was threatened with being prosecuted for the crime of biology, which was in those days having premarital sex, which was indeed a crime in New York State until 1971, that had stood in the way of his having a life with his parents. And it wasn't that he regretted having been adopted by this wonderful couple, the Rosenbergs. He loved them, but it was in an instant this man saw the journey that he had made from his birth name, Stephen Earle, to his life as David Rosenberg. And his voice was very weak at the time. And I said, what do you want me to do? Well, what do you want me to do with this information?" And he said, "Try to make sure this doesn't happen to other people." And I had no idea at the time in 2014 of the incredible, expansive adoption industrial complex that separated roughly 3.5 million birth mothers from their sons and daughters, often forcibly. And I had no idea about the matching system that many adoption agencies believed they had down to a science, particularly in the case of Louise Wise Services, which handled David's adoption. I had no idea about the numbers, as I said. I had no idea about the vast number of maternity homes to which young women were sent to live out their pregnancies in shame, in secrecy, in punitive conditions that operated like low security prisons. And that the women were told, like Margaret Erle, David's birth mother, that they would go on one day to have children of their own, that they would forget about whatever happened, and that it all worked out for the best. So for me as a journalist, hearing hearing the words from David that his mother loved him his whole life, hearing that she hadn't wanted to give him up, from a man who was at the end of his life as a 52-year-old man, the healing that that represented, the peacefulness of that understanding was a human story, and one of healing for him, one of healing for Margaret to be able to find him. And for me as a human being, it seemed that it really deserved not only the telling of a narrative, but the telling of what happened to the huge numbers of people whose experiences echoed that. So that's what I did. I spent 4.5 years not only highlighting and getting to know Margaret Erle Katz, who, as a teenager, married her son's father. They eloped. They did everything they could in their power to try to keep their baby from this system. Margaret had no understanding that when she finally was coerced into signing surrender papers for her firstborn son, that it was a permanent arrangement. No one explained it to her. She didn't see a copy of the paper she signed. She didn't really know what they meant. And even though she didn't actually fully believe that this was all going to be for the best, she tried to console herself with that belief for 52 years. And ultimately, mother and son did meet for a 3-week bittersweet reunion in which she tried to pour 52 years of deferred love into 3 weeks. And David died in late 2014. And I wasn't able to report more to him personally about his experiences, but I did the best I could with people he knew from throughout his life. And of course, I told Margaret's story in great detail. And I used their twin narratives to try to explain this adoption industrial complex that really flourished in the years after the war, in which there was no birth control, even for many married couples. It was against the law until a Supreme Court decision in 1965. There was no sex education, certainly no abortion until 1973 nationwide. And most importantly, for the first time for young people in an era in which the sexual revolution was simmering, privacy. And whereas in the 20s and 30s, if you had had a pregnancy out of wedlock, you would be forced into a shotgun wedding. But suddenly, in the years after the war, for white people, there was a middle class to aspire to. There was a new suburban idol, which did not have room for unwed mothers or unwed motherhood. So suddenly, the national goal beginning in 1946 was to create big families. That's, of course, the beginning of the baby boom. And women were expected to have children, to be fruitful and multiply. That was their patriotic duty. And if you were unable to conceive in those years, it was as much of a shame as being pregnant out of wedlock. So, behind closed doors, this adoption industry had emerged and, again, as I said, flourished and believed that it could play God in matching the child of an unwed mother to the right family. And it became very, very clear to me that this was an industry. The birth mothers were the means of production, the babies were the product, and the prospective adoptive parents who were desperately trying to create families in an era that worshiped, that fetishized the nuclear family, they too were caught up in this web of commerce. And in many cases, the babies went to people who made the biggest donations to adoption agencies. So I think we all know that paradigm. The people who are listening here understand that very well. But as a journalist, it was shocking to see on onion skin paper the details for myself. So that's what I came up with.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle. It's, like I said, so moving. My story is so similar to David's in so many ways. My birth parents also married. I had full siblings, no opera singers in my background, but it's, so many parallels. And so it's really been wonderful to see the reception that your book has gotten just in the very short time in the last couple of weeks that it's been out. And I wonder if you could talk about your biggest takeaways when you've done many interviews, many very high profile interviews, which we're all thrilled to see this go mainstream. What do you think are the biggest maybe myths or misconceptions or lessons learned even from now being a spokesperson?
The biggest takeaway from me is still trying to convey, not trying to convey, because I have no problem conveying it, is that the narrative of adoption in those years, these secretive closed adoptions, were that this was the best for everyone involved. Every party wound up better off. The birth mothers wound up better off because the shame of their alleged wantonness would be concealed. For the child who was born, and I say this, using the terms of the day out of wedlock, the taint of illegitimacy. I also use that word. It's not one, that's the word of the time, would be forever erased. But most importantly, these secret closed adoptions helped reassure adoptive parents that nobody would come interfere with their newly created family. And that to me was, I hadn't fully understood that whole paradigm going into this. The other biggest takeaway for me, and the most shocking thing, was the experimentation that was done in the name of matching by child welfare officials, by people who were sworn to care for children, physicians who were sworn with the Hippocratic oath to do no harm. And in fact, it seemed to me that's all they were doing, when the science at the time was indicative of the absolute contrary. For example, in 1952, I don't know if you all are familiar with the work of the great child psychiatrist John Bowlby, who examined the impact of children, babies, toddlers who were separated from their mothers during the London Blitz, or children who were separated from their parents in routine hospitalizations, which hewed at that time to plague rules. It's interesting that we've gone back to that. But in those days, it was in the early 1950s, late 1940s, if a child had to be hospitalized, for example, for a broken arm, he or she had to stay in the hospital completely separated from his loved ones, his or her loved ones, for 10 days. And they used to observe these children, and they would first be very agitated and, rocking in their cribs, and finally they would settle. And that was a belief that, oh well, finally they've calmed themselves down. But Bowlby came up with this theory that no, they were suffering deeply inside. They were losing an attachment, the attachment that reassured them, that made the world safe for them. And so he published this vast study called Maternal Care and Mental Health in 1952, which was the equivalent of a mega blockbuster on Oprah's best books list. It was published worldwide. In English alone, it sold 400,000 copies, and it very clearly stated the incredible importance of a child being able to develop a secure attachment, if not with his mother, then the same caregiver. And yet, in so many of these agencies that prided themselves on matching the best baby to the best parent, these children were kept in observation for as much as 6 or 9 or even 12 months. They were, in the case of Louise Wise Services, they were experimented upon, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the alleged objectives of care in these agencies that touted themselves as caring for children was in fact the opposite. It was really a, a business, as I've said before. But not only was it a business, there were so many sinister actions that at least what I discovered Louise Wise was absolutely in the middle of. And one of them, by now, maybe some of you have heard of that, heard of what they did. Of course, Louise Wise was the agency that is most well known for separating identical twins and triplets. And they believed that they could somehow figure out the age old question to which matters more, nurture or nature. And so by separating these identical siblings, and putting one in the home of a doctor or a lawyer and the other in a shopkeeper's home, they would answer that question once and for all. But they didn't just stop there. They believed there was a pediatrician on the board of Louise Wise who actually had a harebrained theory that the smartest babies were the ones who cried the most. And how to measure that? Well, he came up with a study funded by the US government for 15 years that attempted to measure a child's intelligence by inflicting pain. And initially, they ruled out electric prods, they ruled out heat prods. And this pediatrician and his cohorts, again, also child welfare officials, came up with the idea of um, creating a rubber band gun that shot a rubber band, the same kind you would have around a pile of mail, shooting that at a 10-minute-old baby's foot for as many as 7 times in order to elicit a 60-second wail, and measuring that cry. And then, I know it's hard to hear, measuring that cry and then allegedly establishing a child's intelligence following that child essentially for the first 3 years of his or her life to see how that child performed on IQ tests when they were old enough to take whatever rudimentary IQ test you could possibly give to a 3-year-old. But they did that experiment. They were called induced crying experiments. And again, as I said, they were funded by the National Institutes of Health for 15 years. And those babies, the babies who did the best in those tests, who cried the most, who responded the most to this painful snap of a rubber band, were referred to in the literature as blue ribbon babies, which is hard to say, it's hard to hear. It was hard to look at those studies and hold them in my hands. But it's important that this information be exposed. That's part of our history. So
Gabrielle, as you research this, how do you think that the child welfare professionals of the day justify their actions to themselves?
it's interesting, the Louise Wise agency was a Jewish agency, and I'm Jewish, and I really had to ask myself, how did they do this, especially in the years after the war? It's important to note that the United States had signed the Nuremberg Codes in 1947 in direct response to the horrors of the Holocaust, which of course did just horrific experimentation, not only on twins and triplets, but on people in general, on babies, on women, everybody. And what the Nuremberg Codes did was establish the importance of any medical experimentation, any medical study of giving informed consent, of requiring informed consent. How do you get informed consent from a 10-minute-old baby? Well, you don't. Certainly, the birth parents of that baby didn't give informed consent for induced crying studies, but the custodians of those babies did. The custodians of Louise Wise Services clearly, they were the masterminds behind this. And the only thing that I could come up with, I asked bioethicists, I would present this horrific series of experiments to all sorts of people, but especially bioethicists who said, wow, the only way that you could justify something like that is if you convince yourself this is really science, this is really for the betterment of the cause, that we're doing this in hospitals and not concentration camps. It is actually science. I have no idea what was going through their heads, but they really, I believe they thought they were creating a better product, a better family than Mother Nature could provide herself. So the ends justified the means, even if it involved 10-minute-old babies.
Wow, that's stunning. I'm almost speechless. What has been the response of agencies, now when your book is coming out and talking about these things?
I have not heard word one. I did hear a word from a social worker who I had interviewed for the book, and she said she was looking forward to reading it. She was quite open with her own conscience and had said, we really, even she was in post adoption services at the time, and she's retired now, and she said, we knew that we were telling those girls something that wasn't true. We told them that they would forget. We told them that they would go on with their lives. But many of us were mothers ourselves, and we knew it couldn't possibly be true. Some of the other social workers who I interviewed for the book, and I have not heard from them, told me at the time we were in love with our power. Another one said we really loved the authority we had as young. They were young women. They were early 20s, late 20s. And one of them told me we felt like we were on the admissions team at Harvard. But I have not heard from anyone in the adoption system. I've heard from many, many, many adoptees, many, many, many birth mothers, a couple of birth fathers, a few adoptive parents, but no one who was involved in the system, entrenched in that business side. And that's what it was. It was the business side.
Um, So as you look at the history, this historical period of adoption, bring it up to today. What do you think is the impact of that history on today's practices?
I would hope that by opening the eyes of people of a mainstream audience to what went on behind closed doors, what happened to 3.5 million women, 3.5 million fathers, 3.5 million of those sons and daughters, and the infinite possibility, infinite numbers of people who are affected also by adoption, that we can take an honest look and try to right the wrongs of that period. And one of the ways we can do that is by looking at these closed these closed birth certificates and understanding that adult men and women whose original identities were stolen absolutely deserve the right to access their original birth certificates, to access their original identities. To me, it is an absolute ludicrous anachronism that needs to be paid attention to now. This is a year of great social reckoning, and there's so much we need to look at as a country, but equality should be ubiquitous. There is no reason why an adoptee who was born in Oregon, which opened its records, which passed a law to open its records in 2000, Alabama not far behind, New York, as many of you know, just last year. There is no reason that someone born in Texas as an adoptee doesn't have the same rights as, as me, a not adopted person who can, if I lose my original birth certificate, all I have to do is, I grew up in a rural county in Oregon. All I have to do probably is just walk into the county with some form of ID and say, I was born on such and such a date. Can I have a copy of my birth certificate? And the very idea of the infantilization of some social worker somewhere saying, you don't have the right to this is appalling. And the more people understand that that is what actually is the law in the vast majority of states, the sooner we can rectify those wrongs.
Yeah. It took us a long time here in Ohio, and we were finally successful 6 years ago. 25 years of repeated legislation over and over again. So at the end of your book, in the last chapter, which I love, you call it No More Secrets, you talk about the apology that was issued by the Australian Prime Minister in 2013, acknowledging the government's complicity in the 150,000 forced adoptions in the decades after World War II. Do you ever see something like that happening here in this country?
What's interesting is the person who issued that apology was a woman, Julia Gillard, a woman prime minister. I would love to see that happening. I think that the more momentum this issue gains, the more people who are talking about this openly, the less secrecy there is, the less shame, the more shame that we shake from the entire systemic process, the more likely it will be that that might happen. I would love to see it front and center. We have so many so many forces to reckon with. We have so many things that we've done wrong as a country. But again, as I said, I think equality should be ubiquitous. I would love to see it happening. I would love to see it on on the agenda. I don't think it's there yet nationally, but that doesn't mean that it can't be soon. Do you see it happening?
Unfortunately, I probably not in the near future, um, but I hope someday. It's happened, to some degree in multiple countries.
In Canada and not not I know it's sort of province by province, but there has been, I know Trudeau issued an apology a few years ago. Ireland is certainly reckoning with this on the news. My news alerts from Ireland are almost daily.
Yeah.
So the outrage is there and it is sparking awareness. So I hope that can happen here.
So in your book, you also touched on the perpetuation of secrecy in assisted reproduction and sperm and egg donation, cases where doctors have used their own sperm, which is now coming to light because of DNA testing. Can you talk about that? That's maybe the next generation here.
Well, I definitely think it's the next generation. And I think that people are fooling themselves if they think, because of DNA testing, they're fooling themselves if they don't think that the egg donor they used or the sperm donor they used, that their son or daughter conceived from that third party technology or second party or third party reproductive system. Sometimes there are surrogates involved as well. I think it's absolutely ludicrous for people to expect that this secrecy will persist. But there are certainly, again, because this is such a multi-billion-dollar industry, the shame that we talked about early on about infertile couples in the years after the war. Well, now you, if you are an infertile couple and you have the means, you can you can use an egg donor, you can use a sperm donor. Certainly, gay couples are very open about the fact that that's how they conceive their children. But we need to be aware that secrecy, people are not secrets. People shouldn't be secrets. Everyone should be entitled to their biological origins, regardless of how that biology was achieved, whether it was the old fashioned way, whether it was in a lab, whether it was from I started doing a story, it was just before the pandemic, going through the egg donor uh, pamphlets that were, they were glossies. They were like 8 by 10 glossies of beautiful, supermodel-ish woman after supermodel-ish woman who had gotten perfect SAT scores and also was an athlete. And people are fooling themselves if they think that the identity of those women is going to remain secret for forever. Some people are very open about it. They integrate the egg donor into their lives, into their new family. They if they go the route of a surrogate, they integrate the surrogate into their lives. But other people are very, particularly gay couples, do that. But there's still so much shame and secrecy surrounding infertility in this country that I know that's not happening universally. And because there's so much money involved, I'm also aware of the fact that there are a lot of lawyers who are engaged in helping maintain secrecy. And again, as I said, assisted reproductive technology is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So the adoption industry in the years after the war, if you know, if you amortize the what the industry was worth in those days, I'm sure it would be similar to what the assisted reproductive technology industry is worth today. It's the same, it's got the same aim, which is creating the perfect family. The matching techniques of the rubber bands are not that far off from the SAT scores of the tall, blue-eyed, olive skinned. You can pick her, you can pick who you want. Egg donor or sperm donor.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the color glossy photos and, people trying to pick out the best genetic stock. I'll never forget seeing ads from the Edna Gladney agency and, them touting, these beautiful women and all of the benefits they got from staying on the campus during their pregnancies, and, another infamous agency.
Absolutely. And to me, it reminded me just today, I was flipping through the pamphlets that Georgia Tan, the infamous baby thief who operated out of Memphis, would send nationwide. She literally advertised children as the perfect Christmas present. And she would plump them up and make them beautiful and curl their hair and position them as your perfect future child.
Yep. Yeah, advertisements and media. She might actually even be on this call, but the author of the book, The Baby Thief, Barbara Raymond, lives here in
Oh,
the Cleveland area, and we know her well. So
she was a great help to me in the writing of this book. She's terrific.
yeah, she used to be on our board of directors a long time ago. Barbara's wonderful. So shout out if you're buying Gabrielle's book. Also look into The Baby Thief. Can you reflect a little bit on nature versus nurture and what you've learned about that through this research?
The apple does not fall far from the tree. I hate to put it like that, but the number of people I've met, particularly David himself, David, when he found Margaret and learned that his late father, George Katz, late birth father, they had so much in common. And while he was exposed, David's adoptive parents, David's adoptive father was a renowned cantor. And David himself became a renowned cantor who was steeped in the traditions of Jewish liturgical music. But as I said, his birth sister, his baby sister, was an opera singer in Berlin. Did I say that? I think I mentioned it. His baby sister had this parallel vocal career. And it's not that, if you had two people who worked in a bank, that would be interesting. But two full siblings who had careers as professional vocalists, that's like two unicorns. And David also he grew up in a very cerebral home. Again, as I said, extremely loving, but he was a real athlete and he became a hockey player. And his birth father was a baseball player who had, speaking of Ohio, his birth father had relinquished a scholarship to Ohio State as a baseball player in order to try to do everything he could to marry Margaret, to thwart the adoption, to try to do everything teenagers could to prove their fitness as parents who were going to be responsible. So that's just one small case that I that fell on my lap because I knew David and then I got to know Margaret and I've seen these parallels with these families. But I went to several Cub meetings, I've been to several AAC meetings, and the number of people who show me, none of this is going to be a surprise to any of the people who are listening and watching tonight, but the number of people who would routinely show me, here's my reunion, a photograph of the reunion that I made with my birth mother. We were wearing identical clothing. I mean, identical. A white blouse with a black vest, black pants, and a black headband. This was, would have been in the early 1990s. Okay, that's not just wearing a white shirt and black pants. It was down to the black vest with the black headband.
Mhm.
And those every single time I come across something like that, I find it chilling. Someone called me, not called, but sent an email today of the reunion that he had in meeting his mother. They had an identical Toyota maroon truck with the same exact leather seats, the same year, the same. I mean, after a while, it goes beyond coincidence. To me, there's something that's so much larger, deeper, that we understand. So what I am saying is, of course, nurture is important, and nurture can give you tools that you wouldn't have otherwise maybe been exposed to in your life. But the nature the nature element of one adoptee I know absolutely hates vinegar and mustard. He hates the sour Northern European food of his adopted family. And when he got into reunion with his birth mother, he learned that he was Italian on his mother's side. And it explained his love of pasta, of tomato sauce, of tomato anything, which was not something he'd ever been, it was sort of forbidden in his house. And I guess the nature part of it is just something that is so much more powerful than we could have ever imagined in the baby scoop years. And I think it's something that people who avail themselves of second party assisted reproductive technology really need to be aware of. You can't escape your biological heritage, who you are born, who your essence is, no matter what the journey is to become the person who has a different name, who's raised in a different household. There's no way to circumvent that.
Um, Thank you for that. A lot going on in chat about people's feelings and personal situations. So I think a lot of people are resonating with your words. So thank you. So to close us out, because we're running short on time, this was a quick hour. What do you think that the future of adoption should be? If you could redesign the whole system, what would you do?
Well, obviously, the trend toward openness is something that's welcoming. Not everyone who conceives a child is able to raise that child, is willing to raise that child. But in as much as that son or daughter who is raised in another home by parents to whom he or she is not genetically related, to the extent that young person can know his origin story, can know his or her family tree, can know the events surrounding his or her birth, to the extent that that birth parent can be integrated into the life of an adoptee, the better. The literature is really solid on that. And the secrecy of the past is, people often ask me, are you against adoption? Of course, I'm not against adoption. I'm against secretive, closed, shameful adoptions with phony origin stories. The Somebody interviewed me the other day, an adoptive father of two girls from China, and he seemed pretty woke to start with, but then he just repeated this refrain of, well, my two girls were abandoned in a rice paddy by their birth mothers because of the one child policy and girls. And I thought to myself, really? Are you really repeating that? You're repeating what you were told. You're repeating the story your girls are now going to believe about themselves. And you owe it to them, you owe it to yourself to find out more of the truth. You owe it to yourself to educate yourself more on what happened in those years in China. You owe it to yourself to allow them to be curious. That's one thing I would, oh, that's another thing. When people say, oh, I'm an adoptive parent and my child isn't curious, I think to myself, maybe your child isn't curious to you, but what is your child, what is your son or daughter actually believing about him or herself, and what kind of openness have you allowed that son or daughter to have in expressing that curiosity that the literature says routinely adoptees have? Okay, yes, great that you chose me. I appreciate this life I have with you, but why didn't my birth mother choose me? It's important to be able to allow exploration of that question, which is really pretty dramatic, but it is essential in helping raise a child into a solid adulthood.
Yeah, I think some of the most poignant circumstances I've seen over the years are when adoptive parents step up to really help their child grieve that loss and grapple with some of those tough issues that you would never as a parent want to see your child going through, but this is the reality of our lives. So Gabrielle, we could listen to you all evening, and I know that you've had a very long day, and we so much appreciate you being here and being a champion for us and speaking our truth and getting that out there into the world. With that, I'm going to close us out. I'm really just so moved by everything that you said, so thank you. As many of you know, Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization. We serve individuals and families that are impacted by adoption, kinship care, foster care. We're extremely excited to be partnering with experts in our national, state, and community to offer this Monday evening speaker series. In addition to this series, we have multiple opportunities throughout the month for support, education, and advocacy. And you can find out more about our organization and our work on our website, which is adoptionnetwork.org. We are a membership organization, and we hope that you'll consider joining us as a member. Please join us next on Monday, February 22nd, in a couple weeks, when we host E. Wiley discussing fertility fraud, the fertility industry, and genetic identity. So carrying on some of these same themes. I'm going to put a couple more links in the chat as we close out. And again, Gabrielle, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming, and feel free to reach out to me on social media. I also have a website, www.gabrielleglaser.com, and please feel free to reach out with comments or thoughts or things I could do better. Let me know.
Thank you. I did put your website in the chat as well, so people do.
Okay, terrific. Okay, thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.